Hello everyone. Today's case involves two separate cases that took place just a couple years apart, but would have extremely similar situations take place as young mothers began to be found dead and their homes set ablaze in British Columbia. Aimee Beaulieu was born June 22nd of 1972 to her mother Judy and was raised in Salmo, British Columbia. Aimee worked at a market in Summerland, a district municipality on the west side of the Okanagan Lake, in the interior of British Columbia, Canada. She was known as a real spitfire who stood her ground. In 1990, Aimee was around 18 years old and she was pregnant with twins. Said to be struggling to leave an abusive relationship, she turned to her coworker named Teresa Coetsier for help. While Aimee's partner was away, Teresa and her husband would help Aimee pack up her things and move 350 kilometers away to the city of Nelson. However, after this, the two would lose touch. The following year, on April 22nd of 1991, Aimee would give birth to her twins, a boy and a girl, who she named David and Samantha. The little family would settle in the Klein's trailer park, just outside Nelson city limits, her mother Judy living next door. In April of 1992, the twins were now around 11 months old and Aimee was 19. The Nelson Fire and Rescue was said to be young and enthusiastic, having recently put out some big fires in the city. The shift officer at the time was a man named Simon Grimpmaw, who recalls that the night of April 2nd would turn out completely different than expected. That night, around 1:53 a.m., the Nelson City Police would discover Aimee's trailer completely set ablaze and would call in for assistance. Firefighter Lieutenant Jamie Spence would arrive and begin to search the trailer, trying to knock down the fire. Shift Officer Grimpmaw had the night off, however, he was also called in due to the trailer that was set ablaze outside of town. Every available firefighter in the area ended up being called in, including the chief, and 2 pump trucks and a tanker was brought in as well due to no fire hydrants being in the area. Upon arriving, Grimpmaw recalled that the scene was both chaotic and somber. Aimee's mother Judy had to be held back from running inside the trailer herself, as first responders attempted to fight the flames that threatened to take over the entire trailer park. The fire team was also said to not be prepared for casualties, as they hadn't really experienced that in their careers so far. But once they entered the trailer, they realized this wasn't just a simple fire. 2 firefighters would pull out the bodies of 11-month-old David and Samantha from the trailer and began to attempt resuscitation. Firefighter Jamie Spence also ended up being sent for treatment at the Kootenay Lake District Hospital for smoke inhalation. In the end, 19-year-old Aimee and both of her babies ended up being pronounced dead at the scene. In the days that followed, the department underwent a critical incident debriefing to deal with the post-traumatic stress that the firefighters were dealing with. And this incident was actually the reason that launched the department for placing a greater importance on the mental health of its firefighters, which is critical because these first responders witness horrific things. And I'm glad that they realized that and they put different measures into place. Now, at first, investigators thought that the fire had started due to a cigarette being left in the bedroom that set the trailer ablaze. However, once word spread all the way to where Teresa was living, she knew that something was very wrong with the situation. Teresa would quickly contact the RCMP and inform them that Aimee would have never done such a thing, saying, quote, "There's zero chance that she ever smoked in bed. It was like nails on a chalkboard to people. That was her end of all ends of existence. She would never smoke in her bedroom. Ever." End quote. Nearly 2 weeks after the horrific discovery, police began to suspect that Aimee had actually been murdered before the fire had been set, revealing that evidence showed that Aimee had been strangled before the fire had began and her twins had both died of smoke inhalation. Dana Urban was the Crown prosecutor at the time in Nelson, who said that the RCMP had taken extra measures during the investigation and had a suspect, but never found enough evidence to recommend charges. The fire had also destroyed so much evidence. After this, a $6,000 reward would be set for information that would lead to an arrest. Aimee's mother Judy saying, quote, "I can't understand how anyone would murder that little girl and those babies. I'm not sure I can be nice enough to ask someone to come forward, but it would give me peace of mind knowing why Aimee and her babies had to die. She never hurt anyone in her life. She touched everyone she had met." End quote. Now, what was discovered inside the trailer was that the smoke alarm in there actually had no battery in it. They would also discover that neighbors had previously responded to Aimee's trailer when the alarm had gone off in the past. However, the night of the murders and the fire, no alarm had gone off. Dana Urban saying, quote, "Either it was an accidental fire caused by someone other than the suspect, or the suspect did it and was smart enough to not fall into the carefully laid traps that were laid out for him. I don't know what the answer to that is. I've always believed it was a homicide." End quote. In the fall of 1992, a woman named Anna Mascarine had been working at a transition house in northwestern Ontario, but fear for an ex-partner had forced her to leave family and friends. She ended up taking a job with Nelson Community Services and moved to the city during a time when Aimee and her children's murders were a common conversation topic. Even though there was no actual physical evidence other than, the stories that Teresa has come forward with that she helped Aimee leave an abusive partner, DV has seemed to have been accepted as the underlying cause of Aimee and her children's deaths. There was a program at the time ran by volunteers that housed women and children fleeing from violence, and in 1995 they would establish what is now still known as the Aimee Beaulieu Transition House in her honor. The Transition House assists women with planning for escape, how to be safe in the community, and with legal details. It also has a program that offers counseling for children. There are said to be 8 beds for women and children who are offered 30-day stays. Now that stay unfortunately doesn't seem to be long enough for some due to the housing crisis and shortage in the area, so there's normally a waiting list for other people to come in. Another program that came into effect after Aimee and the twins' murders led to Nelson Fire and Rescue's biannual initiative for knocking on residents' doors and checking the status of their smoke alarms. But things would take a strange turn just a couple years later in the town of Cransbrook, which is about 250 kilometers away from Nelson. That's when 24-year-old Susan Roberts and her children, a 13-month-old son named Josiah, his twin brother named David, and her 3-year-old son named Jonathan, would also encounter a similar fate. Susan had relocated back to the area just 3 years prior with her son Jonathan at the time, in an attempt at a fresh start. That's when, through church, she would meet a man named Dean Roberts, who was a construction contractor. The two would be married in September of 1992. Susan would then become pregnant with twins, and they move into their townhouse in the area of 2nd Street North, not long after the twins were born. The young family was said not to have much, and that money was an issue at times. But they had each other, and as far as their friends and family knew, they were happy. On July 18th of 1994, around 3:30 p.m., Dean would leave work and went to Safeway, which is a grocery store, then going to a car lot before arriving home around 5 p.m. Dean, Susan, the children, and Susan's brother, Doug Redman, would all eat supper after this, and then Doug would eventually leave. Susan then bathed the children and put them to bed, while Dean ran to the grocery store shortly before 9 p.m. to grab cigarettes for Susan. At 9 p.m., Susan would call her mother, who wasn't home at the time but would leave a voicemail. In this message, Susan said, quote, "Hi, Mom. Hi, Walter. It's Monday night at 9 p.m. Just wondering if you were coming into town tomorrow to visit me. I'm tired tonight, so call back tomorrow morning. I love you, Mom." End quote. Sadly, just an hour after that voice message was left, Susan's townhome would be set ablaze. The fire also starting near Susan's bed. 13-month-old David and 3-year-old Jonathan would be the only ones rescued from the fire. Jonathan was rescued by a neighbor. Susan would be found inside deceased. However, little Josiah was missing, being found 2 days later in an abandoned landfill at the eastern edge of town, about a kilometer away from the townhouse. Jonathan would end up surviving minor injuries. However, little David would sadly pass away in hospital 6 days later from severe smoke inhalation. Autopsies would end up showing that both Susan and then her son Josiah, who was found in that landfill, were both killed by strangulation before the fire had been started. A rope had been found wrapped twice around Susan's neck, and what appeared to be part of the same rope was found tightly wrapped 3 times around Josiah's neck. Susan's body was found lying across the bed of the master bedroom with obvious burns to the head, neck, arms, and chest. But when tested for presence of any smoke or soot in the lungs, none was found, meaning that they were dead before the fire had been started. In the aftermath of the murders, Susan's 26-year-old husband Dean, who was the father of the twins, would write a letter that was read by a pastor during a memorial service that said, quote, "I don't know how to live, how to get up each morning, except as a way to honor Susan. Some people, no, most people, get to experience what is right in life. I got to experience what is perfect, albeit for only 3 years. But it will have to be enough for me to take with me till I see her again. The good memories are endless, the bad memories are none. I love you, Sue, my darling, my wife, my life." End quote. A family friend named Terry Harris would recount watching Susan grow up and maturing into a thoughtful, caring mother who wanted nothing but the best for her children. She loved everyone, was very genuine and very outgoing. He remembered the happy times at the family cabin on Ty Lake, saying Susan gave a lot to others, especially her young family. Her former boss at Pizza Hut would say, quote, "She loved kids. As a teenager, she was fanatic about babies and kids. She really loved kids. She was a real good person." End quote. After this, the Cransbrook RCMP would contact the Nelson RCMP because of the remarkable similarities in both Susan and Aimee's cases. Both were young mothers with young twins that all died in both fires in their homes where the fires were set near the mothers' beds, and now both mothers seemingly were murdered before the fires were started. Nelson RCMP Constable Kim Weberg saying, quote, "I have been asked by the Cransbrook office to ask a suspect in the Aimee Beaulieu homicide as to where his whereabouts were on the date of their homicide." End quote. Meaning at one point, there was a suspect in Aimee and her children's murders, it seems. Which I'm really curious who that was because I couldn't find it anywhere in any of the old newspaper articles. It makes me wonder if it was her ex, which is why there are so many rumors and that where, the allegations seem to go that her and her children's murders were because of DV. However, a U.S. serial killer expert who is unnamed would caution the RCMP about drawing conclusions from the similarities of both cases. But I will say, I find it so strange that these two mothers with their twins would be killed in very similar fashions, almost to a T, in two different cities in the same province, a couple years apart. Very odd. Very specific, though, for a serial killer. It seems like something that you would see on an episode of, Criminal Minds. Like, the serial killer had a mother who was, abusive to him and his twin, and so he went and killed mothers that had twins. It's just very odd. Another thing I found strange in Aimee's case was that there were reports that her fire alarm worked before, but then on the night of the fire, the battery wasn't in it. So could that have been the perpetrator taking the battery out of the alarm so that no one came to the rescue in time? Or was it just a simple mistake that the battery wasn't changed that led to rescue being delayed, even though this terrible thing happened? And I'm really curious if it was similar in Susan's case. I didn't see any mention of an alarm. However, it does seem like rescue came fast enough from the neighbors. Like the neighbors were alerted because one of them saved one of the children. But Susan's case also wasn't going cold. Susan's 28-year-old ex-boyfriend named Daniel Darrell Dost, who is the father of 3-year-old Jonathan, was living in the Lower Mainland in Vancouver's West End, and he would end up being sought by the RCMP. His last known whereabouts were in that area after he had vacated his apartment. Police saying, quote, "We're trying to track him down and meet and talk and establish his whereabouts. We're not saying he's a suspect or anything. We're looking for him and that we'd just like to talk to him." End quote. So at that point, Daniel had not been involved with raising his son, and his whereabouts were unknown because he had no contact with that side of the family. So authorities were attempting to track him down to rule him out. And they eventually would. When police would end up speaking to Daniel, he would claim that he was at home with his girlfriend that night, which was around 900 kilometers away in Nanaimo, BC. He also said he hadn't seen Susan nor his son since 1991 and denied allegations that he abused Susan. However, things would take a big turn when a year later, Susan's husband, Dean, would end up being arrested at a Vancouver hotel after being lured into a sting operation where the RCMP officers posed as drug dealers. Now, before I tell you what police allege Dean told their undercover agents, I need to tell you about what Dean's initial stories were when he was initially interviewed right after the murders. In Dean's initial version of events, he claimed to have come back from the store and everyone was in bed. He said he showered, then went to see Susan in their master bedroom. Dean claims he rubbed his wife's neck a bit until she appeared to fall asleep. He then claimed he cleaned up the supper dishes and left to go for a drive, locking the door behind him. Dean said he then headed to find a ranch in Wycliffe that his father had told him about, but when he couldn't locate it, he headed back for Cranbrook. Along the way, he called a couple of friends and left messages saying he wanted to get together and play pool. He arrived at another friend's home a short time later, and it was there that he received a call informing him of the fire. Now, what Dean would end up telling the undercover officers was similar, yet very different and very disturbing. Police claim that Dean allegedly told them that while he was giving Susan that massage, he ended up strangling her, specifying that he maneuvered a rope underneath her neck and double knotted it and then put a knee into the back of her head. Dean allegedly saying, quote, "Like I killed her. I killed the second child, put him in the woods. It was like being stoned, above and beyond any kind of drug." End quote. He also allegedly said that he had considered killing his own parents to rid himself of any semblance of family. Police claim he said that he hated Susan and that he had pulled out a $200,000 life insurance policy on her. He then allegedly told the undercover officers that he could no longer stand his little house on the prairie lifestyle and that the only thing that was still holding him back was his one surviving son, Jonathan. allegedly saying, quote, "If I could have him gone, there's nothing. There's no obligation left for me. I'm free," end quote. And in a very Chris Watts twist, Dean allegedly told the undercover officers that he had had an affair with a woman named Pamela Mickelson, alleging, quote, "I'm in love with a person very much so who I can't have," end quote. Dean's alibi at the time of the fires was that he had left about 90 minutes prior to go visit a friend. However, neighbors would claim to have witnessed Dean's late model blue pickup truck driving a block away from home around 11:15 p.m. to 11:30 p.m., and then returning only half an hour later, where he was restrained by friends from going near his house, which was already on fire. But of course, there's two sides to every story, because Tim Croker, who is a co-owner of the construction company that Dean owned, would claim that the night of the murders, he was on his way home from work when he would claim that he received a phone call from Dean wanting to play pool, which, as I said earlier, was something that Dean claimed happened. This was said to be around 10:30 p.m. While he was driving, he claimed to have noticed two ambulances and then instinctively followed them to Dean's townhome, which was set on fire by then. Around 11 p.m., he claims he was the one that called Dean to inform him that his townhome was on fire, and then Dean would arrive about 10 minutes later. Tim told Dean that his children were in the hospital, and then Dean allegedly ran towards the hospital. Now, thankfully, after those claims that the undercover officers made where Dean was saying that he basically would have a fresh start if his son Jonathan was dead, the only surviving person from that horrific incident, social workers would take over and take Jonathan away. It was also noted that the toddler had begun having memories and nightmares about the night that his mother and brothers died. Dean would end up being charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of his wife and children. He was also charged with attempted murder of his 3-year-old adopted son, Jonathan, who he wasn't the father of. Now, it's obvious to me that Dean's parents and his family either didn't know about the claims that he wanted to kill them so that he could have no semblance of family, or they just didn't want to believe them, because they would actually fight back against his arrest, telling the RCMP that they felt they had arrested the wrong individual and that they felt her killer was someone from her past who was afraid she would say something that could injure them. And so her family was killed and purposely made to make Dean look guilty in it. His family was essentially claiming that it was this huge conspiracy. However, there did seem to be some sort of weight to those theories, because Susan had allegedly told a neighbor just days before her murder that she had been physically abused by a former boyfriend and essayed by 3 family members. She was then allegedly threatened by that person if she revealed anything, saying something bad would happen to her. This neighbor also claimed that Susan had told her that Daniel had essayed her while she was pregnant, which he obviously denied. The neighbor then said over a cup of coffee at Denny's that Susan had admitted to her that she'd sped out of the cul-de-sac a couple nights earlier due to an argument with Dean, but didn't specify what it was about. Another would claim that Dean had wanted to put Susan in an insane asylum due to both her emotional state and the fact that she wouldn't provide him with sex. This person claiming, quote, "She said that Dean told her that he wanted to have her committed and that he said that because she had been so cranky, that he'd have her committed and get it straightened out. She was very depressed. She was crying a lot and smoking a lot," end quote. However, the family would bring up as apparently some sort of evidence that just an hour before her murder, Susan had left that happy message to her mother. But I don't think that's any proof of evidence. I mean, there are an endless amount of cases that we know now, especially, I know I brought up the Chris Watts case, where everything seemed fine. Everything seemed normal with this family. And then just one day, the husband allegedly snapped. Even though, this seems to have been planned and thought over in their head for a long period of time about how much resentment they just had. And it's seeming like that is basically what police are saying happened here, although his family is denying that. But I don't think the fact that she left an upbeat message to her mom and then an hour later her husband murdered her is any evidence that he didn't do it. Her parents even said that at first they were shocked because, as far as they knew, Dean and Susan had been happy. They said that Dean had always spoken about his wife and children in a positive manner. But again, after all the cases that we've seen now, it's really not that shocking to see, people appearing happy on social media, or in this case in the 90s, out at gatherings and to family and friends when they chat. Meanwhile, this husband was planning the murder of his entire family. It's sickening. Despite what the family said, there seemed to be a lot of evidence that Dean did do this. The court was told that there was a motive, a desire to start a new life, manifested in Dean's conduct, and a $200,000 insurance policy he had taken out on his wife's life about 4 weeks before she was murdered, as well as the means and opportunity to commit the murders. Now, again, despite all of the claims that this family was happy and that Dean would never have done this. We have the allegations that the undercover officers made that Dean told them. We also have what the neighbors said, that, Susan was extremely depressed about, the situation at home with her husband, and that he was threatening to put her in an insane asylum because she was so depressed. But then, in a very messy, at the time, move, a sex worker would be brought into court, who testified that Dean had had sex with her just 2 months prior to the murders. She then claimed that he paid her $300 for more sex after the murders. She claimed, quote, "He said his family had died in an accident and that it was a fire," end quote. Now, there were a lot of other very severe claims that were made during this court case, including that Susan blamed her issues with intimacy on abuse suffered at the hands of her own brothers when she was younger. She had also made complaints that she never had money for groceries or diapers. A friend even lended her $3,500 to pay for bills. The situation seemed a lot deeper and darker than anyone ever knew. It was also revealed that Dean had planned these murders for 4 months. A doctor would even be brought in to testify that just a week before the murders, Susan, her 3 sons, and an unnamed female teenager, along with Dean, came into the hospital's emergency room complaining of stomach issues. Susan had thought that the chicken dinner she had made that night had caused all the family to get sick. However, Dean was the only one that wasn't sick. Now, this doctor had actually discounted food poisoning at the time because there was a lack of symptoms that indicated food poisoning. The only symptom that would have pointed towards that was vomiting. None of the other symptoms did. The prosecutor would say that Dean had admitted to them to trying but failing to poison his wife that night, whom he described as just a supreme bitch from hell. Now, in the end, of course, Dean claims that he made all of these confessions under duress, due to thinking that the undercover cops at the time were dangerous gangsters. Even though I don't know who would lie about murdering their family to gangsters. Like, that defense just doesn't make sense to me. Like, who would even bring something like that up in detail if it wasn't true? But in the end, after a 5-week trial, Dean would be found guilty on all 3 counts and was sentenced to life in prison with no parole for 25 years. Now, this guy really seems like the original Chris Watts, if you ask me. Murdering his wife and children and then shedding tears when the camera's on. Or in this case, writing a letter about how much he misses his wife and loved his wife and how they're going to see each other in the afterlife and how he experienced the most perfect couple years of his life and that will have to be enough for the rest of his existence. Having a pastor read that at their memorial. Meanwhile, he's the one that did it. Absolutely sick. It is, in a sense, exactly what Chris Watts did, right down to having an affair outside of the marriage and feeling held down by his family, so he had to murder them. Honestly, if this case happened nowadays, it would be insane. There would be Netflix specials about it, I think. From what the prosecution presented, Dean was a sex-hungry cheater who didn't want to be a family man and deeply despised being a husband and parent, and instead took it out on his wife by gaslighting her and threatening to send her to a psych ward. Which, I don't understand why these cases always happen, because there is this thing called divorce. He could have just abandoned his entire family, moved across the country, never seen them again, and, Susan and her children would probably still be alive now to this day. But instead, I don't know why it makes sense that, murder and going to prison is a better option. But hey, it continues to happen, which is insane to me, that, for some reason people think that's a better choice instead of going and living your life. Being looked at as, an abandoner to your family instead of being a murderer, one outweighs the other, really. Despite the ruling, years later in 2017, Dean would file a petition in a Vancouver Supreme Court requesting evidence from the murders, including a cigarette butt, hair, and fiber samples, fingernail clippings, rope, a purple bag, plastic bags, and complete RCMP biology case file, including examination notes, communication logs, and DNA qualification data. And according to this petition, a plastic bag in the purple bag, a cigarette butt, and the ropes used to strangle Susan and one of the children were not tested for DNA evidence. So this petition is basically saying, hey, this stuff didn't get tested, so how do we know for sure Dean was the one that did it? Now, the following year, Dean would actually be denied a bid for DNA testing of the trial exhibits, so a move to seek a review would be made, which would allow him access to the DNA testing in 2021. Now, what I'm curious about is, would this DNA testing reveal anything different? I'm not saying that this evidence shouldn't be tested for DNA. I definitely think it should. It should have been tested back then. There may not have been, the means to back then as we have today. However, what are the coincidences that this evidence is going to show anything different, even if DNA is tested from it? Because what what are the chances that Dean admitted to undercover cops that he murdered his wife and children and he didn't do it? Unless there is some huge conspiracy going on here. Unless there is some serial killer that was going around killing mothers with their twins. What's the chances, that his whole entire family showed up dead and he just lied about all of it? In the end, I think that the evidence should be tested. I don't know why they would stop him from doing that unless, the authorities are scared that the evidence will come back with different DNA on it. Maybe they should just do it themselves then, and maybe just be ahead of it then. But from all of the evidence that was talked about in court, all of the claims of what Dean said, I think it would just be extremely coincidental that he would hate his family and children, and all of these claims would be made falsely then, that he, didn't want his family, and then he took out this life insurance policy, and all of this stuff would just be so coincidental that he didn't do it in the end. But hey, anything is possible, I guess. But let's jump back to Aimee's case. Because meanwhile in Nelson, Grandpa was becoming fire chief in 2008. He would then retire in 2014 after a 38-year career. He still said to keep a photo of Aimee's smoke alarm as a reminder of what may have saved her family. Unlike Susan's case, which has been solved, Aimee and her babies still don't have justice, and there is still such little information or progress regarding her case. What I did see, however, was a lot of talk online regarding her case. Now, one woman said that the records aren't online, but that Aimee had been the only witness to an old man accidentally hitting and killing a woman who was crossing Nelson Avenue. The claim goes, quote, "The old man was scammed out of his pension checks. He was told by Mr. and Mrs. he wouldn't be in any trouble for it if he paid, and the son was the only one who came to pick the money up. The police were there to meet him. Mr. and Mrs. and the son were being charged for fraud. Mrs. ended up with a little ankle bracelet for a while, and that's all I heard of it. Aimee was the only witness they had in that case to testify. She was a former girlfriend of the son involved in that case, but she was murdered before the court date, and her babies." End quote. But other than that, most theories out there revolve around DV and, one of her ex-partners being involved in her murder and her baby's murders. We do have to consider that her coworker claims that a year prior, Aimee had fled from an abusive partner, and that's why she went to Nelson for a fresh start. She wanted to have family nearby. It did seem like at one point in time, police did have a suspect, but it's been decades now, and no one's been arrested. And that mainly may be because police don't have enough evidence to take it to court. I also read online that the Major Crime Squad in Vancouver may have looked over the case but found nothing new to reopen it. Someone also said they petitioned to have those same files sent to the RCMP's Unsolved Murder Division, however it was denied. The worst thing about these older cases is that as they get older, so do the people that were involved in them, and people start passing away. So those that may have known something may have taken it to the grave. So there may not be any way for justice to be served then. And I know there are a lot of people out there who are passionate about Aimee, David, and Samantha's case. And that they have named names on Facebook forums and posts. But I'm not going to name those names here because I don't know enough about them. But there are people out there who have heard the rumors, who live in town or nearby, and that have an idea of what may have happened here. But again, there may just not be evidence, and allegedly some of these people named have passed away, so if that is the case, justice might not be served because of that. What I will say is, please comment down below, let's chat, please share any information that you may know. I'll be in the comment section discussing this with you all. And I think we just need to remember how young Aimee was. She was only 19 years old. She was just trying to start a new life. She was trying to just start a life with her and her babies. And then they were brutally murdered, and there's hardly any information out there and hardly any coverage. Why did Susan and her children's murders get so much more coverage than Aimee and her children's? Aimee, David, and Samantha deserve to have their names spoken and deserve justice too. It's been far too long. So please help do so. Please share out this video, share out flyers, posters, share their name, share their faces. Share articles anywhere that you can. Let's not let this case go cold. Let's not let this case be forgotten about. This teen mom and her children deserve justice. And please let police know that you want this case solved. Statistics show that over 60,000 physical assaults or SA occur every year in BC, almost all which are committed by men. If you or anyone that you know is being harmed, please contact help. Please seek help. You deserve much more than that. All the information for help below. My heart goes out to Aimee and her children's families. I truly hope that they can get answers eventually. And as always, I hope you all stay safe out there, lock your windows and doors, and I hope to see you in the next video.